need to make sure that we're able to prove the existence of God without Scripture. So we're not going to use Scripture tonight. We're just going to use some facts and some things from science and other areas that we talk about. But Paul went into Athens and he didn't try to prove there was a God using the old law. That's all he had access to. That wouldn't have done the Athenians any good because they didn't believe in the old law anyway. They would not have accepted that. So, in the same way, in following that same pattern, we cannot necessarily prove the existence of God to people today simply by using Scripture. There has to be something more that we're able to use. And again, I want you to think about this seriously because it's a very interesting subject, should be to all of us. And if you have any why questions, you just jot them down on a piece of paper and hand them to me. I will do my best to deal with those in this series as we talk about it. Essentially, what this boils down to is two choices. And there's only two. There is either nature itself created itself out of randomness or just happenstance, it just occurred, or God created everything that we see in creation. Now, those are the only two choices. There's not a third option. There's not an alternative where we say, well, maybe this happened and something else. It's either by the fact of what we call evolution, or it is God. And those are the only two choices here. Now, I want to understand that there's not another theory in which you can put your faith. There's nothing else. There is only one out of those two alternatives that is true and that is real. So evolution, I want to begin with that. We'll talk about this a little more in a future lesson, hopefully. Some of the things that are specific that I believe are deceiving about the theory of evolution, and it is just a theory. There is no scientific proof whatsoever to support it, but there are people who believe it. And so because there are people who believe it, we need to be able to answer whatever questions they might have. So here are the general theories or the general beliefs of evolution. Number one is nothing produces everything. That's the first belief of evolution, if you truly follow me. Originally, they say there was nothing. At some point, nitrogen and hydrogen appeared in the universe, and also at some point, there was enough energy that sparked an ignition and an explosion, if you will, caused these two elements to explode, and then we began the process of what we are able to see around us now. That's the first thing that evolution teaches, and everything hinges, with evolution, everything hinges on your accepting that nothing produces everything. The second belief is that non-life produces life. That goes hand in hand with the first one. So after this nitrogen and hydrogen exploded, it created somehow more complex molecules which began to evolve into life-forming cells. Now that's a violation of one of the laws of the universe called the law of biogenesis. You don't have to remember that. That's not going to be something that will be on a test later on. But this law states very simply that life comes from non-life. And we need to understand that is evolution. The law of biogenesis says life comes from life. So when evolution teaches us that life comes from non-life, they're going against that particular law that already exists. Non-life does not produce life. It has never been done. And scientists have attempted this for years upon years upon years. And it has never been done. They always have to start, when we hear about them cloning this or cloning that or doing something, you know what they always start with? They always start with life. They always start with something that is alive, something that is already in existence. And then they are able to duplicate. That's okay. That's fine. That's not a violation of the law. But to say that I'm going to start with this mound of dirt here, and out of this mound of dirt, I'm going to make a human. That never has happened. It never has. It never will. These are things that really irritate me. I think might be the right way to say it. When I hear people say certain things and talk about the age of the earth and things like that, and they start talking about millions, and when I hear that word millions, I immediately turn them off. This earth is not millions of years old. This earth is at best thousands of years old, 6,000 years plus, give or take a few hundred years one way or the other. That's it. That is something that is firmly ingrained in what we should know, what we should believe. But that's the second one, that non-life produces life. The third one, this is with regard to the theory of evolution. The third one is that randomness produces fine tuning. I'm saying it this way because what they tell us or teach us with regard to evolution is that random acts of chance cause life to become more and more complex. We've seen all the models and the things that they say. It was a single cell created and it was in this muck, sort of a watery kind of thing, and then that single cell somehow or another evolved into a more complex cell, and eventually that crawled out of the water, and eventually it developed legs, and eventually it became this, and eventually it became that, until finally we reached this. Now, I don't know about you. I love my body, and I think it's the grandest thing in the world. My wife does too. But if this is the best, that's pretty crummy. I'm overweight. I've got problems. I've got issues. But this is what evolution teaches us. It tells us that randomness produces fine tuning. And I don't understand how that is possible, but that everything that exists in the universe has found its perfect balance. And that's a challenge for me to believe and to accept it. So that's the third. The fourth one that evolution hinges on is that chaos produces information. That things went from a great state of disorder and chaos when this explosion that's referred to as the Big Bang. I'm trying to avoid saying that. When this happened, when this great explosion happened, that a great amount of complex things began to happen. They just kind of set it in motion and it started happening. That violates also a law. That violates the second law of thermodynamics. Now, again, you don't have to remember that, but I just want you to understand that there are certain things in the scientific world that are in place that are very significant when we challenge or question this theory of evolution as opposed to a belief in God. So this law states that everything in the universe is going from just the opposite direction, a state of order into a state of disorder. And that's the way things generally work. Our bodies do not become more orderly over time. This world does not become more orderly over time. In fact, they tend to drift into a state of disorder. Our bodies do not become better, they generally become worse. And we can all attest to that. We can all understand that that's exactly how that process works. So that's the fourth. Chaos produces information. The fifth one is this: unconsciousness produces consciousness. Over time, somehow, humanity began to have a conscious thought. Though nothing like this ever existed in the past, just like that cell that duplicated in the muck, crawled out of the water, somehow it decided, where did that come from? Where did that consciousness come from? That I can't flop around here all the time like a fish. I've got to be able to get up on two legs, and I've got to be able to walk. And then I've got to have arms, and then I've got to have other things. But this is what evolution is asking you to believe. Now, again, I'm just questioning the why, because in order to deal with someone who does not believe or someone who is not sure there is a God, you have to be able to deal with them from some other place than Scripture. We all accept Scripture, we all believe it. I'm not shunning Scripture, and I'm not denying Scripture. Just saying that when you talk to someone who's firmly grounded in this sort of thought process, it's impossible to go to Scripture. Well, let's see what the Scripture says. Well, look here, Genesis 1:1. What does it say? God created the heavens and the earth. Well, I don't believe in God. Well, you're stumped right there, unless you are able to go and say, all right, let's look at this from a reasonable standpoint. Unconsciousness produces consciousness. That's what evolution says. Is that possible? Well, we'll challenge that in a little bit. The last one that I'm going to give you is this, is that non-reason produces reason. Somehow over time, humanity began to think and began to reason. Though again, nothing like this has ever existed in the past. This is what we are asked to believe and asked to accept. And I hope that at the very least, we're able to make the point that evolution is not a no-brainer. Because there are some people that would go, well, that's a no-brainer. Of course evolution exists. We see that. Evolution demands a great amount of faith. In fact, I suggest to you that evolution demands more faith and more trust on its own accord and its own randomness, that it violated every law of the universe that exists in order to bring about life. I would have to have more faith in that than I should have to trust and believe in God. But that's what evolution wants us to accept. All the complexity that we see around us today, all of it, evolution says, accidentally came into being by chance and by luck, nothing more. Now, I think I've stated very clearly the basic beliefs of evolution and that theory. Now let's do the flip side and let's talk about some arguments for God. And again, we'll kind of use the same process. The same process here would begin with me saying, number one, and as an argument for God, cause and effect. Now, this is a very simplistic argument. And a lot of people, because it is so simple, are not overwhelmed by it. They think that it's too simple to say things like this. But it's a good starting point for us. And it simply suggests to us that everything in this world has a cause and an effect. It's the same reasoning. Have you ever seen a magician pull a rabbit out of a hat? Now, it's the same reasoning that we would have in wanting to understand how the magician did that. How did the magician pull that rabbit out of a hat? He showed us the hat. There was nothing in the hat. And then when the time came to impress the audience, he pulled a rabbit out of the hat. Now, you and I both know rabbits don't come out of empty hats. That does not happen. The rabbit had to come from somewhere. We think about some of these famous magicians that we see. I mean, I've seen David Copperfield perform before, and when he opens up, the curtain opens up, and he's just standing there by himself, nothing. And then all of a sudden, it looks like that. He's sitting on a motorcycle. Now, where did that motorcycle come from? You and I both know somebody had to put that motorcycle there. It did not just appear out of thin air. It did not just randomly happen. Well, the same thing exists about the rabbit. It does not happen. So even evolutionists and skeptics understand this point, and they realize that in the beginning, when they say there was nitrogen and hydrogen, you know what they never explain? How did the nitrogen and hydrogen get? How did that happen? There has to be a cause to produce the effect that we have seen in our lives. All right, so cause and effect, that's the first one. And again, I'm not going to oversimplify this and say that's the first thing. The second argument for God would be this: physics. Now, I don't know if you took physics in school or if you've ever studied physics or know anything about physics. But physics affects pretty much everything in our world. And modern science has discovered exactly how precise and how fine-tuned our universe is in order to be able for life to exist here. Now, this is where it gets a little difficult, but I would say there are more than 30 physical and cosmological arguments and parameters that require very precise calibration in order to produce a universe that can sustain life. There are many physicists and many people on both sides. Some people who are atheists, some people who are kind of wavering in between somewhere, they're not sure. But they all, when they study, have come to this conclusion there has to be something more. Now, they will say that privately, sometimes they will say it publicly, that's very rare. But nevertheless, one of them says that gravity is fine tuned to one part, now listen, in 100 billion, 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 billion. I don't know if I'm right that many zeros. Think of the odds that would require a random act to happen, which is what evolution tells us. Think of what would have to line up, everything be just right to have gravity, for example, that is perfect for life. The same physicist says that the possibilities lead us to these odds. Now, those odds would be this: 1 in 10 to the 52nd power. Now, I want you to try to write this number down. Write a 10, and then behind it, write 52 zeros. See, most of us would get confused. We start writing that and go, how many? We'd have to count them all again, you know what I mean? But it's 1 in 10 to the 52nd power that this would happen. A 10 with 52 zeros added behind it. The odds are ridiculous to think that that happened just by random chance. I don't even know how you would say that number. I don't know what that number would be. But if you multiply that with all the other aspects necessary for life, let's think about the earth. Think about the tilt of the earth. Now, we all know that there is, in a circle, there are 360 degrees. The earth is tilted just exactly where it needs to be. You've got a 1 in 360 shot. Those are better odds. But you've got a 1 in 360 shot that the tilt would be just right. But then you have to calculate into that also the distance that the earth would have to be away from the sun when all of this exploded. All of this nothing came into existence. Well, that seriously multiplies the odds against that random act just happening. We know that if the earth were just 1 mile closer to the sun, it would be too hot. And we also know that if the earth was just 1 mile further away from the sun, it would be too cold. And neither of those would allow life to exist. It would either freeze to death or would burn. But randomly, evolution says, this explosion happened and it put the earth in just the right tilt, just the right angle, and just the right distance away from the sun. Oh, by the way, they don't even tell us how the sun got there. They're actually always been there, but that's not for us to think about. You think about all of these things, and the earth is in just the right spot for life. The odds of this are really 1 over infinity. That could ever possibly happen, because we have not yet found the end of space. And we don't talk about that, and we don't consider it. The earth is 93 million miles away from the sun. Pluto, our sometimes planet and sometimes not planet, they keep deciding, is it in or is it out? I don't know. When I was in school, it was in. Now I don't know if it's out or in. I don't really care. Pluto, which was a former planet, or maybe is now a planet, 3,660 million miles away from the sun. Now, of all the places that the earth could end up, there is, to be able to inhabit life, you have to take that 1 to 3,660 million miles and multiply that by 1 in 10 with 52 zeros behind it, and that would be the odds of the earth being perfectly fine-tuned. Now, that will be on the test, so y'all need to remember that. Write that down. I'm just giving you this to impress upon you just exactly how random evolution would have us believe that happened. And it landed just perfectly in the exact right spot with the exact right tilt, just the exact right distance from the sun, no closer, no further away, because this is the only place that life can exist. And I have a lot to say about aliens and people get all talk about these UFOs and things today. This is it. Life is here. God created this world, God created this existence, God created this life. Again, when people start talking about aliens and UFOs, I know people see all kinds of weird things out there. I don't doubt that a bit. But life on other planets that are trying to contact us are somehow interacting with us in our atmosphere, in our existence. We used to have a word for that, but it's baloney. This is something that we need to seriously think about. That everything is perfect, exactly the way it was. And the odds of that just happening are unfathomable for life to exist here. And we've only talking about two aspects of it. Just two. You think there are more than 30 parameters that are required for life to exist. Then you'd have to take the odds that we just gave and multiply those by the 28 other parameters, such as oxygen ratio, the temperature, the humidity, replenishing air, producing food, generating energy, disposing of waste, electromagnetic fields, and so on and so on and so on. You have to take all of those, multiply by what we just said a while ago, in order to say that this just randomly happened. It is physically, scientifically possible that it was a random happening or a random act. That human life exists now just by choice of some random happening. We think about the force of gravity and the odds of it being just right for life are 1 in 10 to the 77th power. Now, you wrote 52 zeros while ago, right? That same 10, 77 zeros. At one shot, that gravity on this planet would be just exactly right. Take a coin. The odds of flipping heads 50 times in a row is 1 in 10 to the 14th power. 10 to 14 zeros behind. We all know if you try that, you would assume that if somebody could flip a heads on a coin 50 times in a row, that the coin would have to be rigged. Because there's no way that that could possibly happen. In the same way, there is evidence that the universe has been rigged, that it is intelligently designed, and it is not by random happenstance or random choice. It just cannot, will not, does not happen that way. Talk about the third thing. Astronomy, biology, and botany. To be brief, we've not even begun to add the faith needed for us to believe the random luck that's brought about by the perfect balance of this earth. The plants produce oxygen that we need. We produce carbon dioxide that the plants need. That was a random happening according to evolution. I believe more simply in that first one we talked about, cause and effect. That God did it just exactly the way God wanted to. That the earth has the perfect balance of water on it. Which is why people that talk about global warming, they freak out about global warming, that the ice caps are melting. Of course they are. And in some years they will begin to build again. You know why that is? Because God established a perfect balance of the amount of water that needs to be on this earth. And it changes as needed. It is not something that is caused by global warming or anything like that. Consider the complexity of the human body. We don't even have to think to breathe. It just happens. Our body does certain things on automatic. If we evolved, our body should have all sorts of evolutionary baggage with us, leftovers of anatomies perhaps that are previously used. And attempts have been made to proclaim such things, but they've been explained. And again, we'll talk a little more about this maybe in a future lesson. I would consider just one of those. How does one evolve blood clotting? Ever think about that? Blood clots in the wrong place cause death. Too little blood clotting, you bleed to death. Too much and you will die. How many people would have died before this evolutionary process became perfect? To the point where we are these days. No human would be left as person after person would either bleed to death or would